and we've been focusing on this sermon series. And I'll tell you, I've been so encouraged by this sermon series. I hope that you've been getting as much out of it as I have. The Sermon on the Mount is one of the most powerful sermons ever preached. I don't say that it's the most powerful because Jesus preached lots of sermons, and I believe each one can be powerful in a different way. But I realized how powerful this sermon was last night. We kind of were settling down last night for what was going to be bedtime in a couple of minutes. And my kids were rowdy. They were just all over the place being rowdy. And so I had them sit down right in front of me, and I opened up my Bible, and I began to read the Sermon on the Mount to them. Not a children's Bible, just straight out of my own Bible. And you might think that I am crazy, and when I started to do this, I began to think about how crazy I was. But as I read it, I realized how powerful it was because they began to ask questions. They said, "Daddy, what does it mean to mourn?" And I began to talk about how mourning means crying and being sad and being hurt for people. And Madison quickly said, "Well, I cry a lot." And I said, "Yes, you do. And Jesus comforts you in that." And then I began to talk about read the pure in heart, and they said, "What is a pure heart?" And I began to say, "A heart that doesn't have any bad things in it." And they all said, "We want a pure heart." And it was really encouraging to interact with them on that. And then I began to tell them about you are the salt of the earth. And each one of my kids loves salt. They love salt. And so they just douse it on the food, and they were just like, "Wow, we love salt. This is really encouraging." And I said, "You can be salt to other people." And then we read, "You are the light of the world," and they began to sing "This Little Light of Mine." And we listened to a video. Why I tell you that is because this sermon is very applicable to each and every one of our lives. Jesus speaks directly to us. We can fully understand this, that even a child can take Jesus' words and understand what he is saying. So we've been working through this. We're still in chapter 5. We're about to close out chapter 5. We have 2 more chapters of this. And last week I talked about a radical reorientation. And like I normally do, I decided, hey, I would like to define this word radical. What does the word radical mean? And so there's a definition up there. And the definition, 2 definitions. The first one says relating to or affecting the fundamental nature of something, far-reaching or thorough. And the second one is a person who advocates thoroughly or complete political or social reform. A member of a political party or part of a party pursuing such aim. And so when you hear the word radical, you might think politically or religiously. And so think about how you've heard this before. There is a radical left or radical right or whatever it may be. And I would argue that radical is an interpretive lens. It's an interpretive method in which we understand things. So, for instance, you might, if we're using the word politically, it's the certain platforms. So the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have platforms, and a radical takes that to the extreme. They interpret the platform to an extreme, and they become a radical. And this can happen on both sides. Or you can see this in how they interpret the Constitution. There can be a radical interpretation of the Constitution, and it's an extreme, and it's off from the center. That is normally what it is. It's not good or it's not bad per se. It's just off from the center. I think sometimes we have to be off of the center, but then also sometimes it's not good to be off of the center. There's also, if we're thinking of it in religious terms, there is radical Islam, right? And so Islam is a religion, the Muslim religion. And radical Islam, these are not normal, they're extremists, And they interpret the Quran to the extreme and interpret it and act so according to. And so there's radical Islamic people, and they are usually viewed as negative. There's also people who are called radical Christians, and this is a negative term that people will use on Christians. They're interpreting it not from the center, but to the far version of that understanding. And usually these people are trying to form a revolution. They're trying to get people away from the center to their form of thinking. And honestly, it's usually about self-preservation, preserving their ideas. So, with all this said, I would say that if you're going to interpret the Bible, you need to be radical. You need to be radical. But what I would argue is that a radical interpretation of the Bible is not about self-preservation. It's about caring and loving for others. So a radical reorientation, as we understand it, is a completely understanding where we no longer care for ourselves, but care for other people. Here's the truth. I fully believe this. You can't read Jesus. You can't read the scriptures of Jesus. You can't read Jesus' voice, the Gospels, the words in bread, and remain the same. Jesus changes everything. And in fact, I have a verse up here. I think Jesus forces us to forsake everything and follow him. And I have Matthew 16:24 here. And this is a verse that Jesus says to his disciples. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Zach, the next slide. What? Hold on. All right. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Every time I look at this verse, I sometimes think we forget what a cross is. It's a torture device. It is painful. So think, whoever follows me must pick up their torture device, must pick up their electric chair, must physically kill themselves, or spiritually kill themselves. Not physically, that would be suicide. Spiritually kill themselves to follow Jesus. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who stood up against Hitler, a hero of the faith, and lost his life for this. This is a man who believed these words. He followed through with them. He says this: the cross is laid on every Christian. The first Christ suffering, which every man must experience, is the call to abandon the attachments of the world. It is that dying of the old man which is the result of his encounter with Christ. As we embark upon discipleship, we surrender ourselves to Christ in union with his death. We give over our lives to death. Thus, it begins. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. This radical reorientation, which Bonhoeffer lived, is a complete and utter understanding. It changes everything. It is no longer about me and what I want, but about Jesus and his will for my life. And so last week we talked about hate. We talked about sexual immorality. And afterwards I began to be asked, well, there must be an exception to the rule, right? What if somebody comes in and murders my whole family? Can I not hate that person? What if there is an abusive husband? Or how can we live in a world where there is no retribution because chaos will reign. I think what's happening here is we're missing the point. Jesus is calling us into this. He's trying to get us to do something and feel something. So what is Jesus trying to do? Well, Jesus is not giving us new rules. Instead, he is trying to produce righteousness. He's trying to create tension in us. The best thing that could happen is that you have tension. I'm telling you to be uncomfortable, because Jesus wants you to be uncomfortable. And then, in this, what Jesus is trying to do is get us to ask, what if we took steps towards this? I'm not going to stand up here and say, you know what, if somebody kills my whole family, I'm going to be all right, and I'm going to love that person, and I'm just puffing up my chest. I am fantastic. I don't know what that's like. I imagine that's going to be very painful. But here's what I do know. Whatever Jesus has for me, I'm going to step into that. So whatever is going on in our lives, we are forced to feel this tension to produce righteousness. Whatever may be going on in your life, Jesus is calling you to take the next step and the next step and feel that tension in that rub. So we dive into this more of this radical reorientation. And so we talked about murder, and also hate is murder in your heart. And sexual immorality, well, lust is sexual immorality in your heart. And the next part we come to is divorce. So Matthew 5:31-32 says this: "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her a victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, let me just say this. Matthew later deals with divorce in 19:3-12. It deals with it more fully. And I'll be touching on that as well, because I think you have to pair the two. But let me say this, that in this society, divorce was a male prerogative. The woman could not initiate divorce. She had no choice in it, and she could be divorced without question. It was a legal matter, and the man did it. The woman had no choice in it. And there were two schools of Jewish thought. The first one was the only reason why you could divorce somebody is unchastity, right? And so we see Jesus modeling this a little bit. But then there was a liberal interpretation of the rule that takes place in Deuteronomy, and it's given in Deuteronomy. And this was a liberal interpretation. So you could divorce your wife for any trivial matter, right? She continually spoils the meal. You could divorce your wife for this. It's a trivial matter. She's not a good cook, so I'm going to divorce her. Or you could divorce your wife for someone else, right? Oh, I'm interested in this other person. I am going to divorce this woman. Well, Jesus is pointing us towards the sanctity of marriage. Let me just say this, that the goal of marriage is sanctification. It's the holiness, being made whole and being drawn towards God, that happens in you and happens in the other person. Jesus calls us to be changed in our relationships, and no better does this happen than in a marriage. And so we should be, if you're married, you should be drawing together and then getting closer to Jesus at the same time. But this is not how the world views marriage, right? The world views marriage and tear it apart. It's kind of tearing this marriage apart. It's all about your happiness. Now, certainly, your marriage shouldn't lead you to always be unhappy. But marriage is not just about you. It's about the other person. So why is Jesus making this point? Why is Jesus talking about divorce and making the point of, hey, do not divorce your wife? Well, I will argue that Jesus wants to protect the vulnerable. Jesus deeply cares for people who are vulnerable, who don't have a choice in the matter of what's happening to them. If a man divorced a woman, it did not matter. He could go and marry another person. But that unmarried woman, that woman who was divorced, had no opportunity. And it harmed this woman and put her in a bad position. This is what Jesus is calling us to do, is for men to steward the gift of marriage. This is a call to the men in particular, but it's also a call to each and every one of us to steward the gift of marriage. That it's an institution ordained by God, and we should protect it. Here is the second thing he's getting at. He wants us to assume success over failure. So obviously, nobody goes into a marriage thinking this is not going to work out. I will say that if there is a person, if you find a person that says, you know what, I'm not really sure if this is going to work out, tell them to run, right? It's not, if you have any doubts, just take a step back. Now, obviously, there can be some anxiety. We all have cold feet when it comes to marriage, but we should not go into it thinking it's not going to work out. But this is a continual mindset. If you have a mindset that I am going to fail, you will fail. If you have a mindset, oh my goodness, I'm going to get sick, what happens? You're more likely to get sick. Now, if you have a mindset, I'm not going to get sick, you are less likely to get sick. I'm not saying you'll never get sick. That is obviously not true. But it's all about mindset. We must change our mindset. So if you go into something, you go into a diet and you think, you know what, I'm just going to try this diet, but if I don't like it, I'm going to quit. I would put money, not literally, but I would be willing to bet that you're not going to finish that diet. Same with exercise. I'll try to work out a little bit, but if I get tired, I'm not going to. Or hard work. If you don't have a mindset that this is going to succeed, you will probably fail. We're always looking for a way out. But our first instinct should be to fight it through. Jesus is pointing us towards the sanctity of marriage to fight it through. Is divorce a last resort or a first exit? The final thing is that Jesus is pushing against finding a way around the rule. Here's what I'll say. A lot of people use this passage to make people feel bad about divorce. I think and assert judgment on people who have divorced. That's not what we should be doing. That's not really what this verse is about. In all of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is calling us to look towards ourselves, not others, right? And think through what are the reasons for getting a divorce. So every time somebody tells me to give a judgment about divorce, I am very cautious. I think the sanctity of marriage is a really important thing. But I'm not going through what this person is going through. Now, I'm not advocating for divorce, but I'm also saying that Jesus loves people. He's not really pointing us towards hard and fast rules. And here's the thing, when we do that, when we create hard and fast rules, we limit the grace that Jesus can do. The original intent is the sanctity of marriage. That's the original intent. But what's really important here, what's really important to Jesus, is caring for each person. Here's what I will rage against. Here's what I will say is a big problem. We have these things called no-fault divorces. That's really, really bad. I don't think you should divorce somebody for any and every reason or to make yourself more happy. But I also don't want to say never is divorce a good thing, because there could be somebody sitting there who doesn't get a divorce, and this husband is terrible and awful and kills the woman afterwards. So we have to leave room, a little bit of wiggle room. But here's what it's pointing us towards. The sanctity of marriage is so important. It is holy and honoring, and we must lift it up. And here's the truth. Our hearts are always trying to break rules. That's what we do. Our hearts are like, how can I get around this rule without actually breaking it? How can I stand on the line without stepping over it? What I will say is we should view marriage as holy and honoring and do everything we can to uphold an establishment that God has given us. Matthew 5:33-37 talks about oaths. So here, starting in verse 33, it says, "Again, you have heard it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vow you made.' But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." So Jesus advocates truth-telling. We are called to tell the truth. There is power in truth-telling. Now let me say this. Jesus is going against the Old Testament. That is what Jesus is doing right here. In Numbers 5:19-22, you can write that down and read that later. There is a demand that God demands an oath to be taken. But this is what Jesus says. He says, if you simply tell the truth, you don't have to worry about these oaths. Moses gave you this law because your heart is hardened. We need to simplify our truth-telling. It's as simple as that. Uncomplicate things by telling the truth. I believe it's Mark Twain that says, if you never tell a lie, you won't have to remember anything. Sometimes we complicate things because we're not telling the full truth. Now, we always look for exceptions, and that is what Israel was doing. I think about children. Maybe you've seen this before. Maybe a child will say something to you, right? "Oh, Mommy, Daddy, I did not do this." Or maybe they say to a friend, "Oh, I will do this." Well, children generally don't always trust other children, right? They're like, "Oh, this is, I think you might be lying to me." And so what do they say? "I promise," right? And when you promise something, you're putting your stake behind it. Well, even the children found this not even appropriate. And so what did they form? The pinky promise. The pinky promise, right? And so if you break a pinky promise, it is fine to terminate your friendship if that person breaks the pinky promise, right? So if I do this. But even the breaking of friendships was not worthy enough. And now children have this pinky promise thumb touch. If you break a pinky promise thumb touch, you are, I don't know what happens to you because you cannot break a pinky promise thumb touch, right? Children have found a way to say, hey, I know that this other person is not going to tell me the truth, so I'm going to find a way to bind them into the truth. Well, Israel had this too. Let's swear by heaven, or let's swear by earth, or Jerusalem, or our heads. And Jesus says, don't do that. Just simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. This is the verse that I tell my children more than any other verse. Let my yes be yes and my no be no. Why do I tell them that? Because usually my yes is not yes and my no is not no. They know that they can break me. They know that they can window me down, and I eventually will say what they want me to hear. So I have to repeat this verse to them, for them, but also for me. But the question becomes, why do we lie? Why do we not tell the truth? Well, I think there's more to this, but I have 3 reasons why I lie, or I've seen other people lie, which is that I lie to look better. I want people to perceive me as a certain way, so I might tell a lie. Or I might lie to avoid conflict, right? Oh, I never said that about you. I never said this about you. Or, oh, I like your opinion. I've said that lie very many times. Or we lie to convince others, right? So we're lying to them, and we're trying to convince them into doing what we want to do. But Jesus advocates for truth-telling. And there's a reason. He advocates for truth-telling because it shows trust in God. If you trust God, you don't care what other people think about you. You care what God thinks about you. We're so worried about our image. I am always worried about my image, and so I might lie to show people a better image of myself than I am. But here's the truth. It doesn't matter your image to others. Let God convince others of your image. Let God convince others of your worth. And you just do the right thing. The truth is, we don't have control. We think we have control. You have a lot less control than you think that you have. And we lie to others to try to gain more control. But what happens? It's just sinking sand. It's just slipping through our hands. Lies do not give us more control. So truth-telling shows a trust in God. But Jesus also advocates for truth-telling because it cares more about reconciliation than recognition. I'm not advocating for being overly contentious. I think that is also problematic. But rather a restored community, which is the church. That is what the church is, a restored community. A restored community works things out. If you have a problem with somebody, go and leave your gift at the altar and go and be reconciled. Basically what Jesus is saying is, stop worshiping and go be reconciled to the person. Maybe you have a difference of opinions, and maybe you'll never come to the same opinion. But you can come to a place to agree to disagree and just say, okay, we are okay, but we disagree. The last one is that, let me say this as well. It cares more about reconciliation than recognition. I recently said an unflattering comment to somebody. Like a really unflattering comment to somebody. I'm not even going to tell the story because I think most of you would be aghast by what I said. And it was just a passing comment. I didn't think anything of it. But I really hurt the person whom I said it to. And here's the truth. I thought it was funny. And I still do. But it really harmed the other person. Jesus cares more about the reconciliation, the going to the person and being honest and saying, you know what, I'm sorry. I said this to hurt you. I'm sorry. Because that's what truth-telling is. It's not saying what you think. It's saying the reality of the situation. And truth-telling involves reconciliation, working everything out. And the third point of truth-telling is that it doesn't demand its own way. How many times do we demand our own way? But the truth doesn't demand its own way. Instead, it doesn't care that much about getting its own way. Now, certainly there are things to fight for, right? That there are things that we must fight for and say, hey, this is the truth and we must stand on the truth. But what happens when you bring God into something which he is not demanding? You bring God into something that he's actually not demanding. And I'm not talking about sexual immorality or anything sinful or something totally terrible, but just in a general opinion, if you bring God into something and you say, this is the truth, I'm presenting God's truth, and this is what God said to me, you are using the Lord's name in vain. You might think, using the Lord's name in vain is just saying God or Jesus in an inappropriate way. But that isn't just what the Lord's name in vain. Using the Lord's name in vain is bringing him into something that he is not a part of. So that's complex, but I see pastors and leaders do this all the time. We have to be careful with our words. And I'll give you an example. You can see that we have new technology here. So we got some speakers up here, speakers back there, new TV. If I stood up here and I said, God is telling us that we need to have the latest technology. He wants us to have shiny new TVs. He wants us to have good speakers. This is sinful. What I am saying is sinful. It's using the Lord's name in vain. Now, I'm not saying it's bad to have these things. I think what is a true statement is God cares for us to be contextual to our situation. And how we are doing that is by using some updated technology that was out of date. But we have to be careful not to be using the Lord and saying, God wants it this way, when maybe God does not want it this way. What we're saying is, we feel like God's calling us to get new TVs, but we may be wrong. Truth telling is being careful to place God's stamp of approval over something. You see this all the time with different prophets. It says, God is saying this, and they're not fully sure that God is saying this. And this brings us to the next part of the passage, which is Matthew 5:38 through 42, which is retribution. You've heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you, take your shirt. Hand it over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So this retribution thing, Jesus wants us to understand and think how this might produce righteousness. You might think that this particular passage, is impossible or unattainable, and that society will go into chaos. But he wants us to understand how it might produce righteousness. Jesus, again, goes against the law. Eye for eye is quoted in Exodus 21:24, Leviticus 24:20, and Deuteronomy 19:21. This command that Jesus gives is difficult, and it's difficult in many different ways. He wants us to see how difficult it is, and what he's advocating for is to produce righteousness through non-resistance over retribution. So I want you to think for a moment, if I was standing up here and maybe somebody got really frustrated with me and walked up and hit me, right? So if they hit me with this side of the hand, they could do a lot more damage than with this side of the hand. A punch is more damaging than a slap. So what happens here is Jesus says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, if they were to slap me on the right cheek, back in the day it would be with the back hand. And this could cause damage. A physical punch could cause damage, right? And I could lose a tooth. There are very many things that could happen. And so Jesus says, if somebody walks up to you and causes damage to you, turn the other cheek to them, the left cheek. Now, if I expose my left cheek to them, they will slap me. Slapping does not cause as much damage. Yes, it hurts. But in this culture, a slap was a show of dishonor. You see this with Jesus, right? They're slapping Jesus. The verbiage there is they're slapping Jesus. Paul gets slapped in the court of the Sanhedrin. It's a show of dishonor. So Jesus isn't necessarily saying, hey, just take all the physical abuse that you can. Instead, he's saying, give up your honor. This sounds very Jesus. Jesus says this many times. Give up your honor. By turning the other cheek, you're saying, I don't care about my honor. I care about you. You care more about non-resistance than retribution. So it's not being a mat to be walked all over. Instead, it's saying, I don't care. And you might think to yourself, well, if somebody hit me, I would fight them right back. And I'm not saying you should let that person beat you up. But a true Jesus follower, a true man or woman in the faith, gives up their honor, runs away, does whatever, so that they can honor Jesus with their actions. The second point is Jesus commands this difficulty and wants us to see uncalculated generosity over legal right. Again, let me say this. He's talking about giving up. You get sued, a shirt off your back, give up your coat as well. There were no frivolous lawsuits in Israel. So we have a lot of frivolous lawsuits now, but there was none in Israel. If you were being sued, you most likely did something wrong. And what Jesus says is, if you've done something wrong, give up more. Why? Because I care about reconciliation. I care more about reconciliation than whether you feel hot or cold. That is how important it is. And what you will see in all of these passages is Jesus is pointing towards reconciliation. Reconciliation is one of the most important things as a disciple of Jesus. And the last one is concern for others over concern for self. So this whole, if somebody forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. In Roman society, if you were not a Roman citizen, a Roman soldier could force you to walk 1 mile. And you would carry his armor. And that is what Jesus is referring to here. And Jesus says, hey, instead of going 1 mile, go the extra mile. Go 2 miles. Show them that you don't care, that they're abusing you. Go above the law and give up time, right? We love time. We don't want to give up our time. But Jesus says, give up your time. Why? Because that person will ask you a question. Why are you going the 2nd mile? And if you go the 2nd mile and they ask that question, they might ask what is inside of you. They might say, hey, you're being salt. You're being light. Now remember, these were Israel's enemies. The Romans were Israel's enemies. We won't even go an inch for our enemies. If somebody frustrates you, you are hesitant to even go an inch. I know I am. But we begin to ask the question, what is Jesus calling us to do? To do anything for anyone. Because caring for others, no matter what, no matter who, is what we should be doing. Because people will begin to ask questions. And that leads to this last part of the passage, Matthew 5, 43 through 48, which is all about love. It says, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So everybody loves their people. The people who are nice to you, who care about you, who are friendly to you. But it is much harder to love people who are hard to love, your enemies, the ones who say bad things about you. But this is what makes Christianity distinctive and powerful. The truth is that God shows love and grace to everyone. God shows love and grace to everyone. That's what prevenient grace is. When you look at the beauty of creation, every person, even the atheist and the murderer and the rapist, can enjoy the beauties of creation. That's prevenient grace. And the Lord gives rain to evil and good people. God lets them enjoy good things, the atheist and the rapist and the murderer. So if God does this, shouldn't we show love to our enemies as well? Now, what I will say, it's only a certain amount. I'm not saying to go completely out of your way to love somebody who is completely evil. Because God gives more grace to those who follow Him. But He shows a certain amount of grace to everybody. So if He does, shouldn't we? And why? Why do we do all of this? You might be wondering, like, what I will say is, these are the things that Jesus says, not me. But the question is, why do we do this? Well, first we want to show others God. We want people to see God in us. But the other thing is because God did it first. He loved our enemies first. So, I swear I have this in my notes. I did not know that Murph was going to read Romans 5, 6 through 11, but I have it in my notes. I'm going to read that because we get a picture of God loving His enemies. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrated His own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, while we still hated God, while we still were heaping abuse at God, while we were still yelling from the crowd, "Crucify Him," while we were still spitting on Christ, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by His blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through Him? For if while we were still God's enemies, we were reconciled. There's that reconciliation coming back again. Everything's about reconciliation. The whole Sermon on the Mount is about reconciliation. God reconciled us to God. Now we are called to reconcile other people to God and to each other. While we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to Him through the death of His Son. How much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through His life? Not only is this so, but we also boast in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. A radical reorientation means always being uncomfortable. Comfortable Christianity is an oxymoron. You should not be comfortable. If anything that I said today tugged or pulled at you, I tell you to embrace that because God might be doing something in that. If anything truly offended you, and there is no God in that, it was probably me speaking and not God. But if God's tugging on you to say, you know what, I need to live this new life, I encourage you to step into that, to seek after God's way, to do the hard work of seeking reconciliation no matter the cost. What does reconciliation cost? Everything. Everything. The Christian community should be a visible, practical community. And reconciliation is how we form this. So let's engage in that in the practice where we saw reconciliation happen, and that is communion. Would somebody be willing to go down? And Marie, would you be willing to go tell them that we're going to do communion?